It wasn't the mud on her boots that stopped the men cold. It was the way she walked through it.
The morning Sable Creek Ranch saw Maren Solberg for the first time.
The sky was the color of a bruise, that particular shade of purple and gray that settles over the Alberta foothills just before a storm decides to be serious about itself.
3 of the ranch hands were leaning against the fence post near the main gate, coffee going cold in their hands, watching the road the way men do when there's nothing else to watch and everything else to avoid doing. The truck that pulled up was borrowed. That much was obvious. Wrong plates, one headlight slightly off kilter, the kind of vehicle that belonged to someone's uncle rather than to the person driving it. When Maren stepped out, she was wearing a canvas jacket 2 sizes too large and carrying a duffel bag that looked like it had seen a war and lost most of the battles. She was 24 years old. She looked younger, and she carried herself older, which is a combination that tends to make people uncomfortable without knowing exactly why. Hector Dunmore watched her from the porch of the main house. He was 61, built like a fence post himself, and had been running Sable Creek for 30 years without once questioning whether his way of doing things was
The right way.
He had agreed to hire Maren because his foreman, a man named Cal, had vouched for her, and because good help was harder to find than people liked to pretend. Cal had worked with her father on a ranch in northern Saskatchewan for 6 seasons. That was the entire sum of her recommendation. Hector had expected someone different. He hadn't articulated what exactly. But not this. Maren crossed the yard with the duffel over one shoulder and stopped at the base of the porch steps. She didn't wait to be invited up. "Mr. Dunmore," she said. "Cal told me to find you first." "You found me," Hector said. There was a pause that lasted just long enough to be something. "I can work," Maren said.
"That's all I'm here to do."
Hector said nothing, which in his language meant, "We'll see about that." He told her Cal would show her the bunkhouse in the rotation and that she'd start tomorrow at 5. She nodded once and walked back across the yard the same way she'd come in, unhurried, straight-backed, like she'd already decided the mud wasn't going to bother her. One of the hands at the fence post, a young man named Dale, who had been on the crew for 8 months and still considered himself the new one, leaned over to the man beside him and said, "She's going to last 2 weeks." The man beside him said nothing, because Garrett, the man beside him, had been on Sable Creek long enough to know that predictions like that tended to embarrass the person who made them. The horse had no official name. That is to say, he'd been named 3 times, once by the breeder who raised him in northern Montana, once by the man who sold him to Sable Creek, and once by Hector's son, Bram, who had purchased him at auction 18 months ago with the particular confidence of a 29-year-old who had grown up on a ranch and therefore believed he understood horses. All 3 names had been abandoned in succession, because none of them had ever truly fit, and because the horse had made it clear in his own way that he didn't intend to answer to any of them. The crew called him Smoke, because of his color, a deep, shifting gray that changed depending on the light, but even that was said with a kind of reluctant informality, the way you might refer to a weather system rather than an animal. Smoke was 16 hands, 7 years old, and had been considered unworkable for almost all of those 7 years. He hadn't always been. That was the part that bothered people most, the part that made them angrier than they might have been if he had simply been born difficult. Something had happened to him before Sable Creek. No one knew exactly what, and the man who sold him to Bram had not volunteered the information. What they knew was this. Smoke did not trust hands, not human hands, specifically the approach of them, the reach of them, the way they came toward his face or his flank without asking. He would tolerate a saddle under certain conditions and on certain days. He would walk a fence line if he chose to. He had broken 2 gate latches and one man's collarbone, though the collarbone had been, by general consensus, at least partially the man's fault.
Bram had tried. To his credit, he had genuinely tried, with patience that surprised even Hector.
But there was something between Bram and Smoke that never translated. A frequency they couldn't share, like 2 radio stations overlapping and producing only static. After 14 months, Bram had quietly stopped going to Smoke's paddock, and no one had mentioned it directly, because the Dunmore men did not discuss the things that had beaten them. The plan, loosely, was to give it another season and then make a decision. Maren noticed Smoke on her 3rd day. She was coming back from the eastern pasture at dusk, her work done, her shoulders aching in the specific way that meant she'd done it right. The paddock where Smoke was kept was set apart from the others, not isolated exactly, but given a margin of space that communicated something without words. Maren stopped at the fence. She didn't lean on it. She just stood there, on the outside of it, watching. Smoke stood at the far end of the paddock with his back to her. She stayed for perhaps 10 minutes, not moving, not making sound, and then she walked back to the bunkhouse and went to sleep. She did the same thing the next evening, and the one after that. On the fourth evening, Cal found her standing at the fence in the dimming light and came to stand beside her.
He was a quiet man.
Cal, economical in the way of men who had spent decades saying only what was necessary and finding that to be enough. You know about him, Cal said. It wasn't a question. I figured, Maren said. He's not a project, Cal said. Hector's made that clear. Nobody goes in that paddock without him knowing. I'm not going in the paddock, Maren said. Cal looked at her. Then he looked at the horse.
He had a rope burn around his left foreleg, Maren said. Old scar. You can see it from here if you know what you're looking at.
Cal didn't say anything for a moment. Most people don't look that close. Most people aren't standing still long enough, Maren said. She had grown up in the Peace River country, which is a place that doesn't ask for your opinion and doesn't offer you much comfort for the asking. Her father had run a small mixed operation, cattle and a few quarter horses, on land that fought back against farming with the particular stubbornness of land that has never fully forgiven being cultivated. Her mother had left when Maren was 11, not dramatically, just steadily, the way a river changes course over years until one day you realize it doesn't run where it used to. Her father had not replaced what left. He had simply continued, which is a different kind of strength and sometimes a harder one. Maren had learned to work beside him in the silences, and she had learned horses the way you learn a language when you have no choice but to learn it. By necessity, by immersion, by understanding that your survival is connected to your comprehension. She was not gentle with horses because gentleness had been taught to her. She was gentle because she had watched what happened when people weren't, and she had understood very early that fear and pain remember longer than kindness does, and that if you want an animal to trust you, if you want anything to trust you, you have to be willing to earn it in a currency it recognizes. Hector learned she had worked 3 other ranches when Cal showed him her file 2 weeks in. He hadn't looked at it before she arrived, which was unusual for him, but he'd been dealing with a fence dispute on the western boundary that had occupied most of his attention and most of his patience.
She's good, Cal said simply.
I can see that, Hector said. What he didn't say, because Hector Dunmore did not say these things, was that he'd noticed her the past several mornings moving through tasks that men twice her age did slower and with more complaint. He'd noticed the way the other hands had stopped making comments under their breath, the particular silence that falls over a crew when someone has proven themselves without making a speech about it. He also noticed she kept going back to Smoke's paddock in the evenings.
He didn't stop her.
He watched from a distance, and he did not say anything, and in Hector's language that meant something too. It was Bram who confronted her. Bram Dunmore had come back to the ranch for the summer, ostensibly to help his father through the busiest stretch of the season, but really, and Hector understood this even if he didn't say so, because the city job that had seemed like freedom at 25 had become a different kind of confinement at 29, and Sable Creek was still the place Bram knew how to breathe. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had grown up certain of certain things, and was in the ongoing painful process of discovering which of those certainties were earned and which were simply inherited. He found Maren at the fence on a Tuesday evening, the light going gold across the grass, and he stood at the corner of the paddock and watched her for a moment before he spoke.
He's not going to come to you,
Bram said. Maren didn't turn around.
I know. We've tried everything.
I'm not trying anything, Maren said.
I'm just standing here.
Bram made the sound that men make when they believe they're being patient and aren't quite achieving it.
My father doesn't want people interfering with that horse.
I'm not interfering, Maren said. I'm outside the fence. There was a pause.
Smoke at the far end of the paddock had shifted, barely, almost imperceptibly, so that his flank was now angled slightly toward the fence rather than away from it.
Maren had noticed.
Bram had not. What's your plan? Bram asked. I don't have one, she said.
Plans make you stop paying attention.
Bram didn't know what to do with that, so he left.
That was the first time he walked away from a conversation with Maren Solberg feeling like he'd lost something he hadn't known he was holding. The incident happened on a Thursday. One of the younger hands, a boy named Kevin, barely 18, eager in the way of people who haven't yet learned that eagerness without judgment is just speed in the wrong direction, had gone into Smoke's paddock to check a loose board on the far fence post. He'd been told not to go in there alone. He'd heard the telling and processed it the way teenagers process warnings that seem designed to limit rather than protect. He didn't make it 5 steps past the gate. Smoke didn't charge him. What he did was more calculated than a charge, and in some ways more frightening. He moved fast and precise, cutting off Kevin's line back to the gate, his body a wall, his eyes flat and wide in that particular way that means an animal has made a decision. Kevin froze, which was the right instinct and the only reason nothing worse happened. Maren was crossing the yard when she heard the sound, not a scream, just a sharp, strangled intake of breath from the direction of the paddock, and she covered the distance without thinking about covering it. She didn't go through the gate. She went to the fence at the point closest to where Kevin was standing, put both hands on the top rail, and she spoke. Not loudly, not with command. Just steadily, in a low, even tone, the way you might talk to someone who is very frightened and needs to remember that someone else is calm.
Kevin,
She said.
don't move yet. Look at me. Kevin looked at her. Good, you're okay. He's not going to hurt you if you don't move. He's just scared. Smoke's attention had shifted, fractionally, incompletely, but shifted, toward the sound of her voice.
I know you didn't mean anything, Maren said, and it was directed at the horse now more than the boy, her voice unchanged, steady as a fence post, steady as the ground. Nobody's going to come in. Nobody's trying to take anything. You're okay. Smoke moved. He stepped back, 2 steps, 3, not retreating exactly, but making room, creating space in the way that horses do when they've decided that something doesn't require a response.
Kevin, Maren said, walk to the gate. Slow. Don't look at him.
Kevin walked to the gate. He was shaking when he came out the other side, and Maren put a hand briefly on his shoulder, not a long gesture, just a moment of contact that said, and then she looked back at Smoke. He was standing in the middle of the paddock. He was looking at her. This was new. She didn't make anything of it. She just held his gaze for a moment, easy and without demand, and then she stepped away from the fence and walked Kevin back toward the bunkhouse, talking to him about nothing in particular, her voice still the same unhurried register, giving him something ordinary to hold on to while his heart slowed down. Hector had seen it from the porch. He didn't say anything to her that evening. He went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a while, thinking about things he hadn't thought about in years. What happened next was not a breakthrough, because Maren didn't think in those terms. What happened was slower than a breakthrough and more durable. She started talking to Smoke in the evenings from outside the fence.
Not constantly. She wasn't narrating her days to him like some kind of confession,
but she would stand at the rail and speak occasionally, in the same low register, about whatever was near enough in her mind to put into words. The weather coming in from the northwest, the condition of the grass in the eastern pasture, a mule deer she'd seen near the creek that morning, moving so carefully through the willows it had seemed almost liquid. She never reached toward him. She never angled her body to face him directly. She just shared the fence line and the evening light, and whatever words came without effort. It was on the 11th evening that Smoke walked toward her. Not all the way. He stopped at perhaps 8 feet, his head low, his ears turned in her direction rather than pinned back. He stood there for 3 or 4 minutes and then turned away.
But it was a choice he had made,
a voluntary closing of distance, and Maren understood what it meant the way you understand certain things in your body before your mind has the language for them. She didn't tell anyone. She kept going back. Bram found out the way most people find out things on a ranch. Someone mentioned it offhandedly in the context of something else, and the information landed differently than it was meant to.
Dale said something at dinner about the horse walking up to the fence the night before, said it in the way you mention weather. Incidental, conversational.
And Bram put his fork down and looked up and said, "What do you mean, walking up to the fence?" He went to find her after dinner. Maren was in the barn, running a brush along the back of one of the working horses, and Bram came in and stood in the entrance for a moment before he spoke. "You've been working with him," Bram said. "I've been standing near him," Maren said. She didn't stop with the brush. "That's not." Bram stopped, started again.
"My father doesn't want. Your father hasn't told me to stop," Maren said.
This was true, and Bram knew it was true, and the knowledge sat uncomfortably in his chest because it meant either his father didn't know or his father had decided not to stop her, and he wasn't sure which bothered him more.
"He's dangerous,"
Bram said. "You've seen what he does. I've seen what happens when he's afraid," Maren said. She put the brush down and turned to look at Bram directly. Her expression wasn't unkind. It was exact.
"There's a difference." Bram stood there for a moment in the particular silence of someone who has been told something true that they weren't ready to hear. "He let somebody rope him wrong," Maren said. "More than once, from the look of that scar.
And nobody went slow enough afterward
To let him forget it." She paused. "He's not mean. He's just keeping himself from getting hurt again." Bram didn't say anything. "I think you know something about that," Maren said. "Maybe most people do."
She picked the brush back up. Bram stood there for another moment, and then he walked out of the barn, and this time he didn't feel like he'd lost something. He felt like something had shifted, like a joint that had been slightly out of place for a long time had moved, painfully, back toward where it was supposed to be. It was a Sunday when Maren first went into the paddock. She'd told Hector first. She'd gone to him the evening before and explained what she'd observed over the past several weeks, not asking permission exactly, but not proceeding without his knowledge either. Hector had listened without speaking, his coffee cup held in both hands, and when she finished, he'd looked at her for a long moment. You think he's ready, Hector said.
I think I'm ready, Maren said. That's the part I can control. Hector had said, be careful, which in his language meant, I trust you to do this. Sunday morning, early, the light just beginning.
Maren stood at the gate for a few minutes before she opened it, just standing, letting Smoke see her where she always was, establishing that this approach was the same as every other approach, even if the fence between them was about to change.
She went in without anything in her hands.
Smoke moved to the far end of the paddock. Maren sat down in the grass at the near end of the paddock, just sat, cross-legged, her back not entirely to the horse, her posture open and unstressed. She stayed there for a long time, perhaps 40 minutes, perhaps longer, while Smoke watched her from the far end with ears that moved through a whole conversation she could read even at that distance.
Curious, wary, curious again.
After a while he took a step toward her, then stopped. She didn't look at him. He took another step, then another. His progress was irregular, interrupted by long pauses, redirected by his own doubt, but the direction was consistent. When he finally stopped beside her, close enough that she could hear his breathing, Maren didn't reach toward him. She let him stand there.
She let the proximity be what it was, unremarkable, undemanding, just two creatures sharing the same patch of Sunday morning. His nose dropped. He breathed across the back of her hand. She didn't move. He stayed. The name came from Bram. He'd been watching from the fence, far enough back not to intrude, close enough to see.
When Maren came out of the paddock an hour later, Bram was still there, his arms across the top rail, his expression the kind that takes a while to put into words. I keep thinking about what you said, he told her. About him just trying not to get hurt again. Maren waited. When he was young, Bram said before everything, there was this stretch of the summer where he'd run in the creek pasture at dusk. Every evening, no matter what.
Like he had somewhere to be. He was quiet for a moment. My mother called him River, because of that, before he had a different name.
Maren looked back at the paddock. Smoke, River, was standing in the middle of the grass, head low, at ease.
River, she said. She tried it like she was learning how it sat. It suits him better than what he ended up with, Bram said.
That evening, Hector came to the paddock fence at dusk. He stood beside Maren the way Cal had that first week. For a while, neither of them spoke. Cal told me your father worked horses, Hector said. He worked everything, Maren said. Horses just talked back more. Hector almost smiled. It moved across his face like weather, brief and real. I misjudged you when you got here, he said. He said it plainly, without dressing it in anything extra. Most people did, Maren said.
I don't hold it against people for what they didn't know yet.
They stood there until the light went, and River grazed in the paddock below a sky that had gone from gold to violet to the deep blue that comes just before the stars commit. And the ranch was quiet in the specific way that it gets quiet when the work is done, and everything that needs to be settled has been, and everything that hasn't been settled yet knows that it has time. She had not come to Sable Creek to prove anything. She had come because it was work, and work was what she knew, and the Peace River country had taught her that you give what you have, and you do not wait to be asked twice. What she left behind her, though she didn't think of it in those terms, was a horse that grazed calmly in the morning light, and a ranch that had learned, without anyone making a speech about it, that the person most likely to reach what others had given up on was often the one everyone had already decided didn't belong.